Hi, Steph. It's great to connect today. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
No, I appreciate it. Nice to be here.
One of my first interests when I graduated high school was personal finance. I just started reading everything I could on it. And I feel like I still benefit today from things I learned when I was 18. So I'm excited to talk personal finance with you. But especially because it's possible for all of us to lose control of our finances. And you've written a little bit about this. And so as you think about your journey in personal finance, what have you learned that you would most want to share with others?
Yeah, well, I probably was the opposite of you, meaning I loved corporate finance. I loved investments. I loved finance, but in a different way. I went to studied finance in college, was so eager to jump into the workforce as in investment banking and eventually private equity, but I didn't appreciate the personal finance aspect and what I didn't know and what I needed to know. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I will tell you, I think one of the biggest couple things, if I can,
Yeah.
but um, the importance of financial autonomy, financial independence. I did not value that at all. Despite my background, um, I let go of that because life happens. And I often say nobody wakes up one day, whether you're a man or a woman, and says, I think I'll lose my financial independence today, right? It happens over time because life gets very busy. And as we, in our personal lives, not in our professional lives, start living and having kids and taking on and dividing and conquering, oftentimes we're not a partnership when it comes to money. And I think that's a really valuable lesson because the reality is, regardless of your situation, life happens, right? Whether it's illness, job loss, death, divorce, whatever the case may be, a pandemic, right? Having more of a partnership, but also an independence aspect of it is hugely, hugely important. And getting to that, quite frankly, can be challenging. And I think that's an important lesson that I learned. I took it for granted.
So you mentioned financial independence, but you also talked about keeping a partnership or maintaining a
Mm.
partnership while also acknowledging that people specialize. So as you think about these, how do we reconcile the specialization where you became a mom and so you let go of some of your autonomy to specialize and now it's kind of a divide and conquer approach. So how do you do both?
Yeah. Well, I think it's first defining excuse me, financial independence is, right? What autonomy is, what financial security really means. And I think too often we associate it with, you know, an amount in our bank account, actions we take, right? I think I've redefined it to say financial independence is really a state of mind. It's saying whatever I'm doing, whether there's divide and conquering in our families, whether like me, I went through a divorce and had to take it all on myself. There's a commitment we make to ourselves that we'll be solely responsible for our financial well-being, that no one can do it better than ourselves. Well, when you're in a partnership, obviously there's two of you. So you do need to divide and conquer. But too often we abdicate completely, whether we abdicate our financial lives or whether we abdicate something that is not about money, right? But it could be about caregiving. It could be, we often say, all right, you know where the money is, but I know where the pediatrician is, right? Well, everybody needs to know both and then some. So I think it's changing the mindset of what independence and autonomy really means, and then understanding you can still divide and conquer, but you can't lean out completely, regardless of, and here we're talking about money, but too often one party does. And that's the biggest mistake people make because, we tend to be a reactive society, not a proactive society. And we have to anticipate life changes and we need to be prepared.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's the state of mind. It's not just giving up, it's not abdicating responsibility. Like you said, you were a financial savvy person,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden you lose control over money.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you a little backstory if I can.
Yeah, please.
I shared, my background. I, jumped in, was very fortunate to become an analyst. Got into investment banking way back in the late '90s excuse me, private equity, when private equity looked so different than it did today. But then, of course, as we've talked about, life happened, and I was pregnant. I had a 2-year-old at home. I was looking at a deal in rural Alabama, and I was asked to get on a Cessna and go and do due diligence. And I sat there going, something has to give, right? My husband at the time was traveling 150 nights plus a year. Um, and frankly, I didn't really like the idea of getting on a Cessna pregnant with a 2-year-old at home. I didn't even really like flying public, let alone, something that small. And so I leaned out, I just said, this isn't, I quit. Now, that isn't, I gave up my earning power there. But to your point, life got busy, and suddenly I was like, you pay all the bills, you deal with this. And all that worked until it didn't. I went through a horrific divorce. I learned my husband at the time was living a double life, having an affair. Everything blew up. And suddenly I was like, wait a minute, I completely lost my independence
Yeah.
despite my background, despite knowing better. Um, and that was my wake up call, And then I started to realize I may not have known anything about personal finance because, to be honest, I didn't. I really knew a lot about corporate finance. But there's a lot more correlation than we think, right? It's just the same definitions apply. It's just using things differently. And, that was a real turning point in my life. It's like, wait, I have to rebuild. I have the skills, but I need to look at this differently. And if I'm this overwhelmed, what is the average woman feeling who didn't learn about this, maybe didn't have my background? And that became my life's mission of blending my story and experience with my expertise to really go and help people.
Well, thank you for sharing something so personal and I will edit that out. Uh, Something so personal and impactful in your life. At the beginning of the episode, I think you said you were going to share two things, and I want to hear your other thing, but I also want to get into some of the nuts and bolts of things you've learned that will help you. So, did you want to share that second thing, and then we can keep?
Well, I think the second thing really is tied is I did not appreciate the emotional aspect of money, that the psychology of it, that, despite my background, like I said, right, and my love for money, my love for finance, my love for numbers, there was a lot of things that I grew up with and modeling that I saw or frankly didn't see that really drove some of my behaviors within my marriage and within my family that triggered a reaction and also contributed to me leaning out. And I think as I was younger, I saw the world more black and white. And I think, like anything, as we age, we realize it's a lot grayer than we saw when we were younger. And the emotional and the psychology of money, and really understanding what holds us back, why we don't talk about it enough. Why, despite our skill sets, some of us play different roles, and the money messages that we carry and the reactions we have. I think that's also a really valuable lesson that I learned and I unpacked and now talk a lot about it because I think that's the starting point of anyone who wants to regain control of their finances.
So it sounds like having a healthy emotional relationship with money, and so that just makes me think, what are some of the most common mistakes that people make in terms of having an appropriate emotional relationship with money?
Well, number one, not talking about it. But then number two is unpacking why. Like, why do we have the relationship with we have? Oftentimes, we're just too busy living out our day and we don't stop to say, let me build awareness around my habits, my good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me build awareness around some of the messages that I, quite frankly, may throw out into the world with my kids, with my partner, the why behind them. Um, is there something that I need to change? We don't stop to build awareness and correct and change course because we have more control over it than we think. And I think it's that pause that makes us think and say, I've got work to do. And that's how you go about that is where it gets a little bit challenging. And quite frankly, I kind of look at it as a little bit of a formula of looking, where are you today, where have you been, and more importantly, where do you want to go and how do you correct course?
So are those some of the questions you ask yourself to help you understand your relationship with money?
Yeah, I mean, I sat back and I was like, Steph, how did you let this happen? Like, you're a finance expert. You knew about this. You were in private equity doing multi-million dollar deals, and yet you don't even know if your name's on the deed of your house. Well, there was some uncomfortable conversations, and I grew up in a world with a lot of conflict. My parents fought. They fought about money. My dad was very controlling, so money was a source of stress,
Mhm.
control, anxiety. So despite my expertise, I just thought I don't want conflict, right? I'm going to lean out of this. You take care of it. It's just easier. But until I kind of stopped to say why, or also why am I in a scarcity mindset when it comes to money? I am so driven in other ways, areas of my life, but yet I am, living in fear and that I'm spending too much or I'm one step away from financial disaster, particularly after my divorce, which you can imagine, so many people feel. And that those are examples of things that you have to stop and say why if you want to change them and adopt a much better, healthier growth mindset, which is really the key to progress.
Really good insight on how the emotional relationship you had with money and how the mindset you had around money had big impacts on
Huge.
basically every day of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can also say society and the role that I kind of what I defined played a huge part into how we divided and conquered. I think there's a really interesting statistic out there that in the 1950s, 65% of families were that breadwinner homemaker structure,
Mhm.
right? And today, that number is more like 20%, right? We don't live like that anymore. Yet, almost 60% of women still abdicate all their personal finances to their husband, particularly the investments and the long-term financial decision making. So times have changed, yet the way we live out in the roles within our family may not be changing. And again, building awareness around that and making a conscious effort, I think is hugely important if we want to make that shift.
Well, and something else I read from you was that at some point, something like 80% of women
That's
will
right.
basically be managing their finances alone anyway.
100%, 80%, 8 out of 10 women will be navigating life at some point alone, either due, I'm sorry to say, widowhood. The average age of widowhood is 59 in this country, but also the rise of something called the gray divorce. People are living longer. There are more divorces now with people over 50. In fact, I think that number has doubled over the last couple decades, but it's tripled for those over 65. So, due to those two things, you're right. 80% of women will end up being alone, and most are not prepared.
So, one of the things that I think about a lot with personal finance is budgeting. And
Yeah.
for some people that, it's really hard. So, what's your relationship with budgeting and how do you view budgeting?
Yeah. So I often think I use a framework instead, quite frankly. I use something called the 45-20-35 model, which is more of a framework for your spending. I think oftentimes when we create a budget and then we start tracking our spending, it can become very restrictive, almost debilitating when we go, oh my gosh, I overspent this week. And
Mhm.
then remember, I talked about the psychology of money.
Yeah.
It gets worse because shame sets in where we are hard on ourselves. It's not empowering, right? It's more crushing that spirit that you're trying to get ahead. So I like a framework to say, all right, how much of my total net income, what's hitting my bank account, should be allocated to three buckets. My unavoidables, those are typically your fixed costs. Those are 45%. Your housing, transportation, utilities, and call it insurance. And then 20% should be investing in yourself, right? Into your future. Whether and that how you spend that depends on your circumstances. Emergency fund, paying off bad debt, increasing money that's going into retirement or even building investable assets that are taxable, outside of your retirement accounts. And then the rest, that 35% is kind of a target for what I call your empowerment money. And when you are very proactive and have a system in place to say, I've got these buckets, and if I need a little bit more in one bucket, I take away from the empowerment money, but I'm proactive in setting myself up to do it in a way where I'm not setting myself up to fail. And I think too often we're spending and spending. Plastic makes it so much easier, right? Than the good old fashioned cash. And unfortunately, what gives, we increase our debt or we're pulling it out of savings. So I'm not a huge fan of budgets at all. I'm more of a proponent of a framework and then setting yourself up to actually live within your means once you have that framework intact.
And this comes back to kind of the emotional relationship and the psychology of money, as you mentioned, because as you said, it can be just incredibly debilitating, demotivating for people when they have the budget, they don't stick to it, and it's so painful. And it reminds me of something that Brad Stolberg shared in this podcast that fierce self-discipline requires fierce self-compassion.
Right.
And I really like that. And then the last thing I'll say about this is I interviewed Avi Kluger, listening expert, and he set a goal to become a better listener every single day. But what he realized really quickly was that he messed up all the time. And so he was trying to get better every day, but he started feeling bad about himself because he realized he was not as good. He was so bad compared to where he wanted to be. And so what he started to do was every time he would recognize that he made a mistake, he would pat himself on the back and say, Good, I recognize I made a mistake and view it as a positive rather than a negative. So I like this framework approach to try to have a much more positive relationship rather than to feel so negatively about, not hitting the budget every month.
Well, and I like what you just said because every challenge creates an opportunity, right? And so the key is acknowledging it, but saying, what did I learn? What did I learn that I can carry forward? And that is the key. Also, let's be real. In the world that we live in, it's very hard to track your spending. It really is because we've got accounts everywhere. Sometimes we're using cash, sometimes we're using plastic, sometimes and so we can track where it's going, but to then allocate it back to a budget. And then to your point, like when we miss it, okay, we don't see it until it's already happened,
Yeah.
until we probably overspent, created more debt, or had to pull out of savings. So we're reacting versus being proactive.
Okay, so how often do you review your finances? Is this like a monthly date you have, a weekly?
Yeah.
What does that look like for you?
I love it. So I talked a lot about execution right there, right? And I have a whole chapter in my new book called How Do You Execute? You can have the best, well mapped out plan and framework and investment plan and a roadmap. But if you don't know how to execute it, it's going to flop. And one of the number one things that I recommend is something called a money date, right? Where you are literally on your terms. I typically do it on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee. Um, in bed with a computer and, looking at everything. And whether you're going through all your accounts and really looking at your inflows and your outflows. And what I've also found in doing that is you also catch things that you never would have seen.
Yeah.
I have caught more inaccurate charges. I've caught even fraud. And then I've caught where okay, let's correct and change course before the month is over because I've only have 1 week where I'm sabotaging myself and my spending. I've got 3 more weeks if I build awareness around it to make a change versus waiting to the end of the month. So I am a huge proponent of kind of having that weekly check-in. And once you get into a habit, and I have a whole process that is laid out on how you do this, it becomes very quick and actually something that you enjoy versus dread. And if you are in a partnership, I really encourage doing it with your partner as well.
Well, and this goes back to the financial autonomy and taking control. And
Right.
taps into the emotional piece of how I can imagine how this weekly check-in, if you're struggling or whatever, this can be like, oh, I don't want to do that. But as you do it, for me, when I do mine monthly, but I can see the benefits of a weekly, and it's so fun and satisfying. And then, like you say, you catch that, oh, there's a subscription here for $500.
Right.
I don't want that. And
Right.
if you're not monitoring, there's just so much waste and fraud, like you said. Okay, maybe another question here is you talk about, well, related to the emotional piece is people feeling embarrassed about their missteps. So, how do you think about embarrassment in terms of financial missteps?
Well, first of all, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about money, right? We keep everything inside. And so some of the shame and embarrassment that we have is because we think the next guy or gal knows more than we do. And that we are, and the reality is, if we start to talk about it or we read about it and really hear stories, which I think is hugely important that we all share, we start to realize we're not alone.
Yeah.
And I think an interesting statistic, particularly around women in money, is shame is the number one thing that holds women back from ever taking. It is embarrassment. And a lot of that, again, is because no one talks about money.
Yeah.
And I kind of laugh and think, I talk about this, give stories around this in my book, but the reality is, if you were to sit around at a dinner party or happy hour with friends and said, "Hey, by the way," like, I'm just curious, how much is your mortgage relative to your income? Or how much should I be spending on, car insurance?
Yeah.
You might get a couple of funny looks, right? And not be invited back. But that's such an example of, the shame that's built is we're trying to problem solve all by ourselves and thinking everybody around us has it figured out, and they don't, at all. No one teaches about, I mean, very few schools now, even
Yeah.
in college,
Yep.
unless you're in a program, teach about this stuff. So where would you learn, particularly if it wasn't talked about or even demonstrated or modeled within your family growing up? So we got to cut ourselves some slack. And then also, too, recognize, and it's something you just talked on, when you get that icky feeling inside, like, oh my gosh, I don't want to sit down. I don't want to do my money date. It actually means you're growing. It actually means you're pushing yourself out of that status quo and you're starting to incorporate something that is good for your personal growth. So I also, when it comes to shame, invite people that when you're kind of getting comfort, feeling that uncomfortable, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable if you really want to make change.
And
And
talk.
that's outside of money, by the way.
Yeah, the emotional side. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm just thinking too about like, why did I get interested in personal finance? And how did I learn this? And it was frankly luck.
interesting.
I had five sisters, and one of them, one day we started talking about money and retirement, and I got really intrigued. And so that was one thing that kind of got me into it. She recommended some books. And then I had a neighbor who was 4 years older than me. And one day we got talking, and he was really into personal finance. He recommended some books, and that also just lit a fire in me. But for my sister, one day talking about it, and this neighbor who we ended up in this conversation with, I never get into personal finance.
It's
I never read. I never learn. And now I just don't know because we don't talk about it.
so interesting. What's the common denominator of both those stories? Communication,
Yeah.
talking about money.
Somebody was
And yet,
talking. They were willing to talk about it.
yeah. Well, and you were willing to lean in and ask.
Yeah.
And that's exactly my point is we don't talk about it enough. We make it such a taboo topic because also we're taught it's not polite to talk about money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so it kind of, again, goes back to the emotional side and recognizing some of those things that we were taught or that we interpreted don't work for us anymore. And we have to change course. And that is, I'm so glad you shared that because the common denominator is conversation.
Is talking about it. Well, this is so interesting. I just think it's so important and relevant for so many of us. Any final things you'd like to share, Steph, as we wrap up?
Well, I think one of the things is we often, too often, put off what we know we need to do till tomorrow.
Mhm.
And one of the biggest, most important things about money is there's no time. I mean, we should have done it yesterday, right? Because in order for us to grow money, we need time is our best, time and consistency are two huge, huge things on our side. And so, I hope this conversation sparks, some empowers and inspires people to recognize, all right, this is a very important part of my life and I can't afford to wait. I really need to start. And even if you start small, even if you, with respect to your actions about money or investing, there's no time like today to start and don't put off because time is definitely not on your side, particularly when it comes to your retirement.
The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago.
That's right.
And invest was 20 years ago. The next best time is today. So
There you go.
I love it, Steph. Thanks
Well
so
said.
much. This is so great. One thing I was going to suggest is I've been having conversations with AI, and this has been really helpful for me when want to learn about a topic. But that can also just feel overwhelming. And so I just appreciate that you have written a book that just outlines so clearly the things we've talked about today, plus so many more. So anyway, thanks. I don't want to say anyway. Um, so thanks so much for coming on the podcast today, Steph.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and thanks for building more awareness around this really important topic.